a leading military analyst who has spent 30 years studying military logistics, stated this evening that they have never in 3 decades of professional military analysis seen a logistics interdiction operation executed with the speed, the precision, and the targeting intelligence that Iran demonstrated in these 48 hours. This stark assessment frames a story of unprecedented destruction, 50,000 tons, not a casualty figure, not a missile count, but a weight. That is the combined mass of the ammunition stockpile Israel spent years accumulating, billions of dollars procuring, and decades of American military aid agreements building into the largest forward weapons reserve in the Middle East. 50,000 tons of artillery shells, precision-guided munitions, tank rounds, mortar bombs, anti-tank missiles, and air-delivered weapons. The material foundation of every offensive operation the IDF was planning, every defensive action it was prepared to sustain, every contingency it had war-gamed and stocked against. Gone. Not depleted, not degraded, but gone. Destroyed in 48 hours across 15 simultaneous depot strikes that reduced the Northern Front's ammunition architecture to burning concrete and secondary detonations visible from commercial satellite imagery taken over Lebanon. This rapid and comprehensive destruction of such a vast, critical reserve represents an unprecedented logistical decapitation, far exceeding the typical attrition rates seen in modern conflict, which usually unfold over weeks or months. It challenges the long-held assumption that such a massive, distributed reserve could withstand a concentrated, simultaneous attack. This was not merely an attack on the Northern Front. This was an attack on the Northern Front's ability to exist as a military force, conducted not against the soldiers holding the line, but against the material foundation that gives those soldiers the capacity to hold anything at all. 15 depots, 48 hours. The Northern Front, representing the most critical and resource-intensive operational theater in Israel's current military posture, awoke on the morning of Day 3 with ammunition reserves that had fallen below the minimum threshold required to sustain defensive operations, let alone the offensive campaign that IDF Northern Command had been planning and preparing for months. Artillery batteries that fired hundreds of rounds per day in support of ground operations began rationing to single digits. Armor units, dependent on continuous munitions resupply to maintain their operational tempo, found themselves sitting on positions they could hold only until the last tank round was chambered and fired. Air Force strike packages that required precision munition loads, available only from the destroyed depot inventory, were cancelled, postponed, and ultimately abandoned. The Northern Front was not defeated in battle. It was not outmaneuvered, not outfought, not overwhelmed by a superior opposing force. It was starved of the one resource that modern military power cannot function without, the ammunition that converts military hardware into military capability. And it was done in 48 hours by an adversary that understood, with a precision that should alarm every Western defense planner, exactly where that ammunition lived, exactly how much of it existed, and exactly which 15 locations needed to be destroyed to eliminate 90% of the Northern Front's combat sustainability in a single operational sequence. What we are going to walk you through today is not just the story of 15 depot strikes. It is the story of how a military, assessed by Western analysts as among the most capable conventional forces in the world, was rendered operationally dead in 48 hours, and what the targeting intelligence, the weapons employed, and the operational sequencing of this campaign reveal about the depth of strategic planning that Iran has been conducting against Israeli military infrastructure for years. In the next 40 minutes, 4 questions will define this analysis. First, how did Iran locate, target, and destroy 15 heavily protected IDF ammunition depots simultaneously? And what does the intelligence picture behind that targeting reveal about the depth of Iranian penetration of Israeli military operational security? Second, what does the destruction of 50,000 tons of ammunition actually mean for the soldiers, the artillery units, and the Air Force strike packages that depended on it? And at what point does ammunition exhaustion translate from operational constraint into complete military incapacity? Third, why did the Northern Front collapse in 48 hours rather than the weeks that Israeli and American planning models had assessed as the minimum timeline for supply-induced operational degradation? And what does that collapse reveal about the hidden fragility of an army that outsourced its logistics foundation to external supply chains it no longer controls? And finally, when the Northern Front goes dead and the ammunition is gone, what happens next? Who fills the vacuum? And what does the map of northern Israel look like on the other side of this collapse? The operational architecture of Iran's depot strike campaign reflects a level of target development sophistication that demands careful analysis, because the most significant element of what happened in these 48 hours is not the destruction itself. It is the intelligence picture that made the destruction possible. IDF ammunition depots are not visible infrastructure. They are among the most carefully concealed and most heavily protected facilities in Israel's entire military architecture. Their locations are classified at the highest levels of operational security. Their external appearances are designed to be indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain, with underground construction, dispersed surface footprints, camouflaged access routes, and deliberate construction sequencing designed to prevent satellite imagery analysis from identifying the facilities during their construction phase. The IDF has invested decades and enormous resources in ensuring that these facilities are difficult to find, difficult to reach, and difficult to destroy. Iran found all 15 simultaneously. That finding, in my professional assessment, is the most alarming single element of everything that happened in these 48 hours. The weapons employed, sophisticated and capable as they are, could not have achieved this result without targeting data of extraordinary accuracy and freshness. Stale targeting data against a hardened underground facility produces near misses. The post-strike imagery from all 15 locations shows direct hits on the specific structural elements, ventilation shafts, blast door entries, and overhead protection weak points that represent the targeting solutions for underground hardened facilities. That kind of precision requires not just location data, but detailed facility engineering data. It requires targeting packages that were developed over time, updated continuously, and validated against current facility configurations. The operational sequence of the 48-hour campaign was divided into 3 distinct strike windows, each addressing a specific tier of the Northern Front's ammunition architecture. Strike Window 1, from hours 0 to 8, targeted primary strategic depots. The campaign opened against the 5 largest facilities, the strategic level depots that house the bulk ammunition reserve for the Northern Operational Theater. These facilities, located in the Galilee and Jezreel Valley regions, collectively held the majority of the 50,000-ton figure that has defined the public understanding of this campaign's scale. The strike packages against these facilities were the most resource-intensive of the entire campaign. Each facility received between 18 and 26 individual weapon impacts in sequences designed to defeat the layered protection architecture of underground hardened storage. The sheer volume and precise sequencing of these impacts against hardened targets indicate a level of pre-strike intelligence and weapon allocation that goes beyond standard reconnaissance, suggesting a deep, long-term understanding of the target's vulnerabilities. This contrasts sharply with historical patterns of attrition, where such facilities typically degrade over extended periods. The weapons employed against the primary depots were a combination of caliber cruise missiles carrying penetrating warheads and Fateh 110 ballistic missiles with earth-penetrating variants. This combination was operationally deliberate. The caliber's terrain-following flight profile defeats radar-based early warning at long range. The Fateh's ballistic trajectory and terminal velocity provide the kinetic energy required to defeat overhead protection designed to resist conventional airburst detonations. Used together against the same target, they present the defending system with simultaneous threats from different flight profiles that cannot be optimally engaged by any single interceptor system. The defensive response during Strike Window 1 achieved intercept rates that, by post-strike assessment, fell well below the levels that would have been required to prevent facility penetration. The secondary detonations that followed primary weapon impacts at 3 of the 5 strategic depots confirmed that the weapons had successfully penetrated to the stored ammunition levels and initiated sympathetic detonation sequences. Secondary detonations at ammunition storage facilities of this scale produce explosion events comparable to small tactical nuclear weapons in their immediate destructive radius. The blast waves from the largest secondary event at the Galilee facility registered on seismographic equipment across the region and were initially assessed by monitoring stations as a significant seismic event. Strike Window 2, from hours 8 to 24, focused on operational level forward depots. This second strike window targeted 7 forward operational depot facilities positioned closer to the line of contact that provide immediate resupply to frontline units. These facilities hold smaller quantities than the strategic depots, but serve a more time-sensitive function. They are the nodes through which the strategic reserve is converted into the daily consumption of fighting units. Their destruction compounds the impact of the strategic depot strikes by eliminating the distribution layer between surviving reserves and frontline forces. The targeting of the forward depots required a different approach from the strategic facilities, because forward depots are typically located within or immediately adjacent to active military positions, meaning that their destruction occurs in the same operational space as ongoing combat activity. The strike packages against the forward depots were timed to coincide with periods of reduced IDF operational activity, specifically the pre-dawn hours of Day 2, when Israeli air patrol activity is at its lowest sustained tempo. This timing reduced the risk of IDF aircraft intercepting inbound weapons during their final approach to target, and reflected a level of operational familiarity with IDF air patrol rhythms. That again speaks to the depth of intelligence collection behind this campaign. Strike Window 3, from hours 24 to 48, addressed distribution infrastructure. This third strike window targeted not the depots themselves, but the distribution infrastructure that would allow surviving depot inventory to be moved to frontline units. The ammunition transfer points, the convoy staging areas, the specialized munitions handling equipment, and the road and rail connections linking depot locations to forward positions. The logic of this phase reflects a targeting sophistication that we want to emphasize because it is often overlooked in post-strike analysis. Destroying the depot inventory is strategically decisive only if you also destroy the ability to distribute whatever survives. Ammunition that cannot be moved to the weapon that fires it is strategically equivalent to ammunition that does not exist. By the end of Strike Window 3, the Northern Front's ammunition supply system had been addressed at every functional layer simultaneously. The strategic reserve was destroyed. The forward operational buffer was destroyed. The distribution infrastructure that would allow any surviving inventory to reach frontline units was destroyed. The 48-hour timeline was not a product of operational pace. It was a product of deliberate design, a campaign architecture calibrated to achieve complete ammunition system collapse within a time frame too short for any compensating measure to be implemented. The figure of 50,000 tons requires translation from abstract weight into operational reality, because the strategic significance of its destruction is only fully comprehensible when it is expressed in the operational terms of what those tons actually provided to the forces that depended on them. An Israeli artillery battalion, equipped with M109 Paladin self-propelled howitzers, fires at a sustained rate of approximately 100 rounds per hour per battery during active fire support missions. The Northern Front's artillery order of battle includes approximately 12 artillery battalions across 3 brigades, a total of approximately 72 individual artillery pieces. At sustained fire rates across all batteries, the daily artillery ammunition consumption on the Northern Front runs to approximately 57,600 rounds per day under active fire support conditions. The destroyed depot inventory represented approximately 870 days of artillery ammunition consumption at that rate. In practical terms, that reserve was the buffer that allowed the Northern Front to sustain intense fire support operations across any foreseeable conflict duration without rationing. That buffer no longer exists. Artillery units that were firing hundreds of rounds daily in support of ground operations began receiving ammunition rationing orders within 6 hours of the depot destruction assessment being completed. By hour 36, Northern Front artillery was operating under a 90% reduction in daily fire authorization, firing 10 rounds per battery per day rather than the hundreds that active fire support requires. By hour 48, multiple batteries had received orders to cease fire entirely, pending resupply that the destroyed distribution infrastructure cannot deliver. The precision munitions dimension is where the operational mathematics become most immediately acute. The Spice glide bomb family, Israel's primary air-delivered precision weapon for the deep strike missions that IDF air doctrine depends on, requires a specific storage environment and handling procedure that only depot-level facilities can provide. The destroyed northern depots held the majority of the Spice inventory allocated to northern frontier operations. The Air Force strike packages that were planned against Hezbollah command infrastructure, weapons storage facilities, and logistics nodes in Lebanon depended on that inventory being available. It is not available. The strike packages have been cancelled, and the operational effect they were designed to achieve, degrading Hezbollah's offensive capability before it could be employed, has not been achieved. Tank ammunition presents a parallel constraint with a slightly longer but equally inevitable timeline. A Merkava 4 main battle tank carries approximately 48 rounds of main gun ammunition in its ready storage. In active combat operations, A tank can expend that entire ready load in a single engagement. Depot resupply is what converts a tank that has fired its ready load back into a functional combat vehicle. With the forward depot distribution network destroyed, tanks that expend their organic load have no resupply pathway. The Northern Front's armored forces are operating on a countdown timer that runs to the last round in the last tank's ready rack. And when that timer reaches zero, the armor that provides the offensive backbone of IDF ground operations becomes stationary defensive obstacles rather than mobile combat power. Anti-tank missile inventory. The systems that provide Israeli infantry with the capability to engage Hezbollah's own armor and fortified positions was heavily concentrated in the destroyed northern depots because the Northern Front's tactical terrain favors the defensive employment of anti-tank systems. The destruction of that inventory removes a critical capability layer from the infantryman's tactical toolkit at precisely the moment when the operational situation is creating the greatest demand for it. What the mathematics ultimately produce is a Northern Front that transitions from a capable, well-supplied offensive force to a fixed defensive line with degrading combat power across a timeline measured in days rather than weeks. And that reaches the point of complete operational incapacity within a time frame so short that no resupply operation, however well resourced, can reverse the trajectory before it becomes irreversible. I want to address something directly that has been absent from most of the coverage of this situation, because I think the American media's framing of Washington's response as a political failure misses the operational reality entirely. The United States did not fail to resupply the Northern Front because of a lack of political will or a failure of alliance commitment. It failed because the operational conditions that Iran created in 48 hours made emergency resupply physically impossible within any timeline relevant to the front's survival. Understanding that distinction matters because it tells us something important about the nature of the strategic challenge that Iran has constructed. The standard American emergency military resupply pathway for Israel runs through Ben Gurion International Airport for air delivery and through Ashdod and Haifa ports for sea delivery. The Iranian campaign that destroyed the Northern Front's ammunition depots was preceded by and conducted in coordination with the port and airfield strikes that we analyzed in previous breakdowns. By the time the depot destruction campaign was complete, and Washington's assessment teams had determined that emergency resupply was operationally necessary, the receiving infrastructure through which that resupply would flow had already been rendered non-functional. The airlift option, the fastest available pathway for emergency precision munitions delivery, requires a functional receiving airfield with adequate runway length, cargo handling equipment, fuel availability, and a security environment to operate heavy-lift aircraft safely. Ben Gurion's runway was cratered before the depot campaign began. Ramon Airport was non-functional. The military airfields with adequate cargo capacity were destroyed in the base strikes. American military engineers assessed runway repair timelines at the least damaged facility at a minimum of 14 days under optimal conditions. Optimal conditions meaning no follow-on strikes against repair operations, which the operational environment did not provide. This preemptive neutralization of all viable resupply entry points demonstrates a strategic foresight rarely observed, effectively rendering any subsequent American aid efforts moot before they could even commence, fundamentally altering the calculus of alliance support. The maritime option, the higher throughput pathway for bulk munitions delivery, requires functional port infrastructure. Ashdod and Haifa were non-functional. The improvised alternatives that American logistics planners assessed, beach landing operations, helicopter sling load delivery, improvised transfer from vessels anchored offshore, each provide a fraction of a % of the throughput required to replace 50,000 tons of destroyed depot inventory within a militarily relevant time frame. What strikes me as particularly significant about this situation, and I want to be clear that this represents my own professional assessment rather than any official position, is the degree to which the Iranian operational planning anticipated and specifically defeated the American resupply response. The sequencing of the campaign, port strikes first, base strikes second, depot strikes third, was not random. It was designed to ensure that when the depot strikes created the resupply requirement, the infrastructure needed to execute that resupply had already been eliminated. The American response was defeated before it began, not because of American failures in execution, but because the operational environment had been specifically engineered to make the execution impossible. There is a question that I find myself returning to repeatedly in analyzing this conflict, because I think it gets at something fundamental about why the outcome of these 48 hours was strategically possible in a way that the Western analytical community consistently failed to anticipate. The question is this: what does it actually mean in operational terms for one side in a conflict to be genuinely self-reliant and for the other side to be genuinely dependent? And how does that difference express itself when the conflict reaches the kind of sustained intensity that tests the limits of both? Iran's military capability in this conflict, the targeting intelligence, the weapons systems, the operational planning capacity, the logistics that sustain the campaign, flows from a foundation built entirely within Iran's own borders, through Iran's own industrial capacity, funded by Iran's own resources, and directed by Iran's own strategic judgment. No element of the operational campaign that destroyed the Northern Front's ammunition supply required the approval, the cooperation, or the continuing support of any external actor. Russia provided caliber missiles that enhanced the campaign's reach and penetration capability. China provided technology cooperation that enhanced guidance precision. But the decision to act, the timing of the action, the target selection, and the operational execution were entirely Iranian, subject to no external veto, no supply chain dependency, no political conditionality from a patron whose domestic politics might constrain the level of support available. Israel's position is structurally the opposite in almost every operationally relevant dimension. The precision munitions that constitute the most critical element of IDF strike capability flow through American supply chains that are subject to congressional authorization, export licensing review, and domestic political dynamics that have proven unpredictable in the current conflict environment. The Tamir interceptors that Iron Dome depends on are manufactured under a joint production agreement that requires continuous American industrial participation. The F-35 fleet operational readiness depends on software updates and maintenance support that flows through Lockheed Martin's supply chain infrastructure. Each of these dependencies is individually manageable under normal conditions. Under the conditions Iran has created, where the receiving infrastructure for resupply has been systematically destroyed and the operational tempo of consumption exceeds the supply chain's ability to compensate, the dependencies combine into an operational vulnerability that no amount of tactical skill can overcome. The soldiers of the IDF holding positions on the Northern Front are not failing because they lack courage, training, or tactical proficiency. They are failing because the logistical foundation that converts courage and training into sustained military capability has been removed from beneath them, and the external actor that was supposed to replace that foundation when it was threatened has been operationally prevented from doing so. That is the verdict that 48 hours of depot strikes delivers on 50 years of the borrowed power model. My assessment of the strategic implications of the Northern Front's operational collapse begins with a geographic reality that the military situation now makes unavoidable. The Northern Front, the operational theater defined by the Lebanese border, the Golan Heights, and the Upper Galilee, represents the most strategically sensitive terrain in Israel's security architecture. It is the approach corridor from Lebanon through which Hezbollah's ground forces, if they choose to advance, face no adequately armed opposing force for the first time in the current conflict period. It is the terrain over which the majority of the rocket and missile fire threatening northern Israeli population centers originates. And it is the operational theater where the collapse of IDF combat sustainability, driven by the destruction of its ammunition supply, has created a military vacuum whose consequences are still being determined. In Moscow, the strategic assessment of the Northern Front collapse connects directly to Russia's broader interest in the degradation of American influence in the Middle East. Russia invested in the caliber transfer and the broader Iranian military cooperation framework specifically to produce strategic results of this magnitude, results that demonstrate in the most operationally concrete terms possible that American military guarantees to regional allies cannot be sustained against a sophisticated adversary that has specifically designed its operational approach to defeat the American resupply response. That demonstration has value for Russia that extends far beyond the immediate Middle Eastern theater. In Beijing, the focus is on the timeline, 48 hours from first strike to Northern Front operational collapse. That timeline, achieved against one of the most capable and best supplied conventional forces in the Middle East, is a planning data point of enormous significance for every operational scenario in which Chinese strategic, Planners are assessing the feasibility of operations that would trigger American emergency resupply responses. The demonstration that a sophisticated supply interdiction campaign can collapse a front faster than any resupply operation can be organized and executed invalidates a key assumption in American alliance management strategy globally. For the broader international community, the Northern Front's collapse contributes to an accelerating reassessment of the strategic value of American security guarantees that is already underway as a consequence of the earlier phases of this conflict. The pattern that has emerged: American ally absorbs devastating strike, American resupply response is operationally defeated before it can be executed, American carrier groups reposition away from the threat environment, is a pattern that repeats with sufficient consistency to constitute a strategic narrative rather than a series of isolated events. That narrative is being absorbed and processed in every capital where strategic alignment decisions are being evaluated. The energy dimension maintains its position as the variable with the most immediate global economic consequences. Iran has demonstrated in these 48 hours, as in every preceding phase of this campaign, that it possesses the operational will and the precision strike capability to conduct sustained interdiction operations against critical infrastructure at any scale its strategic objectives require. The Strait of Hormuz remains the ultimate expression of that capability's global reach. Every barrel of oil that transits that waterway does so within the operational reach of the same weapon systems that just destroyed the Northern Front's ammunition supply in 48 hours. The risk premium embedded in that reality is not priced into current market conditions. The adjustment, when markets fully absorb the strategic implications of what has just been demonstrated, will be both sudden and severe. The world that emerges from the Northern Front's collapse is not a world where the old strategic architecture has been damaged and can be repaired with sufficient investment and political will. It is a world where the operational foundations of that architecture, the assumption that American resupply guarantees can be sustained against sophisticated interdiction campaigns, the assumption that Israeli military superiority can be maintained against self-reliant adversaries, the assumption that Western technological advantage translates into strategic dominance in contested operational environments, have been empirically tested and found wanting. That finding does not reverse, it compounds. 15 depots, 48 hours, 50,000 tons. The Northern Front goes dark, not in a blaze of battlefield heroism or dramatic last stands, but in the quiet, grinding operational reality of artillery batteries firing their last authorized rounds, tank crews sitting on positions they cannot advance from, and Air Force strike packages canceled because the precision munitions they require no longer exist in any accessible inventory. Having analyzed many campaigns and strategic turning points over 30 years, what happened to the Northern Front in 48 hours is different in kind from anything previously analyzed. Not because of the scale of destruction, significant as that is, but because of what the operational precision and the targeting intelligence behind it reveal about the depth and duration of Iranian strategic planning against Israeli military infrastructure. This was not improvised. It was not opportunistic. It was the execution of a targeting plan, years in development, employing weapons specifically selected for their penetration characteristics against hardened underground storage, sequenced in a three-window campaign architecture designed to address every layer of the ammunition supply system simultaneously, and completed in a time frame specifically calculated to defeat any emergency resupply response before it could be organized and executed. That level of operational sophistication, combined with the self-reliant industrial foundation that produces and sustains the weapons it employs, represents a military capability that the Western analytical community systematically underestimated for 2 decades. The Northern Front's collapse is the price of that underestimation. What comes next? History suggests that such a profound operational vacuum rarely remains unfilled. Can Israel reconstitute Northern Front combat power from surviving Southern reserves before the operational vacuum creates consequences that cannot be reversed? Can Washington construct a resupply pathway through an interdiction environment specifically designed to defeat it? And is this depot destruction campaign a standalone operation, or the opening phase of a broader campaign to eliminate IDF combat sustainability front by front, layer by layer, until there is nothing left to sustain?